Hashtag medieval torture, the dark arts they hope you'd never discover. What if I told you that your ancestors perfected the art of human suffering to a degree that would make even modern serial killers shudder? The medieval period wasn't just about knights and castles. It was an era where inflicting pain became a science, where devices were meticulously engineered for the sole purpose of extending agony for days or even weeks without granting the mercy of death. Let me introduce you to Heinrich Steinmetz, a 14th-century German torturer whose journal was discovered sealed in the walls of a Bavarian castle in 1978. His detailed accounts of his work reveal a man who approached suffering with the precision of an artist and the detachment of a butcher. What historians found most disturbing wasn't just the methods he described. It was how he meticulously documented the physiological responses of his victims, creating what amounts to the first human pain research studies, centuries before modern medicine. The subject responds most acutely when the separation of joint occurs gradually, Steinmetz wrote in 1382. A sudden displacement yields but a moment of supreme agony, whereas the slow parting of bone from socket produces sounds from the human throat I had previously thought impossible. The tools at Steinmetz's disposal weren't crude implements of pain. They were sophisticated devices refined over generations. Take the pair of anguish, a seemingly simple metal bulb that would be inserted into various orifices of the body, the mouth for blasphemers, the vagina for women accused of consorting with Satan, the anus for homosexuals. With each turn of the key, the petals of the pair would slowly separate, expanding inside the victim's body until tissue tore and bones fractured. What you weren't taught in history class is that these devices were often inscribed with religious iconography and blessed by priests before use. The torturer wasn't seen as a sadistic monster, but as a divine instrument extracting confession and purifying souls. The church didn't merely tolerate torture, it elevated it to a sacred ritual. Court records from 1437 show that torturers were paid bonuses for extracting confessions, creating a perverse incentive system that guaranteed innocent people would admit to anything. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, represents perhaps the most methodical approach to prolonging suffering ever devised. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use an iron hammer to break each limb between the joints, not at the joints themselves, as this would kill the victim too quickly through shock and blood loss. The cracking of bones was deliberately performed in a specific sequence that prevented unconsciousness. A witness account from 1563 describes how the prisoner's limbs were broken in 16 places, yet he lived for 9 days upon the wheel, exposed to the elements, birds picking at his wounds, begging for water that was denied. Modern medical analysis of this account suggests the victim would have experienced hypothermia, dehydration, infection, constipation, muscle necrosis, and unimaginable pain with every slight movement or breath. But perhaps most disturbing was the Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat with the point positioned to penetrate the anus or vagina of the accused. The victim would be placed on top, legs tied together, slowly lowered by ropes with weights gradually added. The orifice would be slowly stretched until tearing began. The genius, if we can call it that, was that the victim controlled their own torture. Relaxing the legs would cause them to slide further down the pyramid, increasing the penetration and pain. Keeping the muscles tense would delay the inevitable, but cause excruciating muscle fatigue. Victims would hover in this hellish limbo for days. Court physicians would treat their wounds and hydrate them specifically to prolong the experience. A French court record from 1591 notes matter-of-factly, the apothecary administered a tincture to prevent infection, as the questioning was expected to continue for 3 more days. What few realize is that medieval torture wasn't primarily about punishment. It was about spectacle and social control. Public tortures were community events with vendors selling refreshments while crowds gathered to watch. Children were brought to witness these horrors as educational experiences. Municipal records from Toledo in 1489 show that schools were dismissed on execution days so students could attend the instructive demonstration. The most shocking revelation about medieval torture comes from financial records rather than the devices themselves. Account books from multiple European cities revealed that torture chambers were significant revenue generators for local governments. Spectators paid to witness private tortures, and families of the accused were charged maintenance fees for keeping their loved ones alive during extended torture sessions. Those who couldn't afford these fees would see their family members subjected to shorter, more lethal methods. Now here's what historians have purposely downplayed for centuries. These weren't primitive people who didn't know better. Medieval physicians had a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy specifically refined through torture. They knew precisely which nerves caused the most pain when stimulated, which tissues could be damaged without causing death, and how to revive unconscious victims to continue their suffering. A recently translated medical text from 1412 contains detailed anatomical drawings showing the nerve clusters that torturers were instructed to target. The text clinically notes the female subject typically sustains consciousness through greater pain thresholds than the male, particularly after childbirth. This suggests medieval torturers had observed and documented gender differences in pain response centuries before modern medicine acknowledged them. The water cure, what we now call waterboarding, was performed with a disturbing scientific precision. The victim would be strapped to an inclined board, head lower than feet, mouth forced open with an iron speculum, nostrils plugged with sheep's wool. Water would be poured through a cloth into the throat, simulating drowning. What makes this especially disturbing is that court documents show torturers knew exactly how much water could be administered before causing death, and they maintained their victims at this precise threshold of terror. A Venetian torturer's manual from 1521 explains, when the subject's eyes bulge and face turns the color of a plum, cease the water flow for exactly 60 heartbeats, then resume. This may be continued for 6 hours before risking the subject's expiration. Consider this. In a time when medical care was primitive, when surgeons didn't wash hands between patients, when childbirth had a mortality rate approaching 20%, torturers had developed techniques that could keep victims alive for weeks while subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. This represents a perverse allocation of intellectual resources. The best minds weren't developing cures or improving agriculture, but refining methods of inflicting pain. The strappado might seem simple, suspending a person by their arms tied behind their back, but it was applied with calculated precision. Weights would be attached to the feet, and the victim would be repeatedly dropped several inches, dislocating both shoulders, but carefully calculated not to break the arms entirely. Court records show victims would be left hanging for hours, then lowered for questioning before the process repeated. Some remained in this state for weeks, their arms permanently deformed afterward if they survived. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is how torture techniques spread throughout Europe through formal knowledge exchange. Torturers were respected professionals who traveled between jurisdictions teaching their methods. Records show they received substantial payment for these masterclasses. A 1476 ledger from Brussels shows payment of 40 gold sovereigns to Master Kruger of Nuremberg for instruction in advanced questioning techniques, an enormous sum equivalent to several years' wages for an average worker. The legacy of medieval torture extends into our modern world in ways few recognize. The psychological techniques refined during this period, sleep deprivation, stress positions, sensory overload, formed the foundation of modern enhanced interrogation methods. The manipulation of hope, briefly relieving suffering to offer the possibility of mercy before resuming, was codified in torture manuals centuries ago and still appears in modern interrogation protocols. When historians examine the psychological profiles of medieval torturers through their writings, they find not monsters but methodical professionals who believed in their work's necessity. They weren't sadists in the modern sense. They were bureaucrats of pain who viewed suffering as a necessary tool for maintaining social and religious order. This makes their actions more disturbing, not less. It shows how ordinary humans can normalize extraordinary cruelty when it's sanctioned by authority. The next time you walk through a preserved medieval town with its charming cobblestone streets and quaint architecture, remember that beneath many town squares lie the remains of torture chambers where countless individuals suffered deaths so horrific that our modern minds struggle to comprehend them. These weren't rare occurrences or the actions of rogue officials. They were the formalized, sanctioned practice of governance throughout Europe for centuries. The true horror of medieval torture isn't just what was done to human bodies. It's what it reveals about human nature and our capacity to normalize cruelty when it serves power. That's the history lesson they don't want you to learn.